Today we're in Exodus, fancy that? Today and next week we'll still be in Exodus, and then there'll be a period of change. So this time, Stuart started last week with the Ten Commandments, which is the first section about laws. People seem to think that the Old Testament is all about laws. It's actually only a small part of the Old Testament that is about laws. It's the smallest part, actually, but that's what people tend to think is the all-important thing and the only thing that happens in the Old Testament. As you've seen, we've had this wonderful story of Moses leading the people under God out of slavery into freedom. We have the next slide. The laws are not just given plonk. They come out of a story. They're inside a story. And this story is a story of liberation. It's a story of God's love rescuing his people out of slavery in Egypt, bringing them to a new land. And a new land with, God. So the laws really are guidelines so that they don't go back into some form of slavery. Because, we can be under slavery to slave masters out there, the big bullies, like the pharaohs and all of that, those Egyptian leaders. That's one kind of slavery. But we can be under other slaveries, like addictions. And people think, that's not in the Bible, is it? If you look carefully, it is. It's not called addictions, so we've got to do a bit of translating. But that God understands it's in human nature. He doesn't want us to get into addictions. He doesn't want us to get into any kind of other slavery that we can easily get ourselves into through the influence of other people or even our own thoughts. So he has given us guidelines to keep us able to live in freedom. That's the whole purpose of this. So we're not going to go back and do the Ten Commandments. Stuart did that last week. But this is the verse that comes at the beginning of the Ten Commandments, which you read, but I'm going to read it again. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. That's the prelude, that's the beginning, that's the purpose, that's the context, if you like. So the laws, whatever he's going to say about laws, come within this relationship with a God who liberates. He's in the middle of liberating. That's what it's all about. Okay, next one, please. These Old Testament laws actually tell us about God's character, if we look for that. So even in the Ten Commandments, what can we find out about God? I've written down 6 things, but of course there are a lot more. So we can discover he does not want us to be deceived by idols. In other words, by anything else that grabs our attention, grabs the first place in our life and then doesn't fulfill what we think it's going to fulfill. That can be an idol too. He doesn't want people getting sidetracked onto the idols of other nations because actually they're powerless. They're nothing. They seem to be glorious, with these great statues and, we've been in India and every street corner you've got all of these temples and statues, and in Thailand too, where our daughter-in-law comes from. But there's no power in them. And they're really images of some of the other stuff that we get into in the West as well. He wants us to have rest and refreshment. Who wants that? I tell you I do. We had a lovely, refreshing day yesterday. That was so nice. God actually wants that. There is no other God on the face of the earth that wants that for people. God, the other gods, want you to bow down in slavery and, bring all kinds of sacrifices, but they're not into rest and refreshment like our God is. That's part of his character. He wants us to have stability in our society. That means good relationships. without people being bullied, without people stealing from each other, without people running off with somebody else's wife or husband. And he wants this stability through good relationships. He wants us to respect God and people. In other words, don't be arrogant. Don't think you're the kingpin. He wants us to be truthful and faithful. Isn't that a good thing in society? Because if we're not truthful and faithful in our relationships, you end up with a lot of disorder, which gets to chaos. He wants us to avoid the slavery of greed. So this is God's character that we see just in the Ten Commandments. Next one, please. We're just going to look briefly at 3 of the laws, the little laws that follow. And there's lots of them. There's 3 chapters of them here. But in the whole Old Testament, that's a small bit. 3 chapters here. So what are the little laws? They actually all relate to the Ten Commandments, but they're made more specific. So here's one. Do not mistreat a foreigner or oppress him or her, for you were foreigners in Egypt. Do not take advantage of a widow or of an orphan. If you do, and they cry out to me, I will certainly hear their cry, says God. My anger will be aroused, and I will kill you with the sword. Your wives will become widows, and your children fatherless. Now, that's meant to be a deterrent. They say, don't start messing with the people who are more vulnerable and think you can get away with it. God sees it, and he's got power, and he can get you. Now, it's a good thing that he can get us, isn't it? Because, if I'm in one of those categories, then I want there to be a protector. I want there to be a God who sees my situation and who cares enough that if the situation warrants it, he'll act. I want that. Don't you? Now, although it specifically says 3 categories, and these are said over and over again in the Old Testament, there's the foreigner, the widow, and the orphan or the fatherless. Okay? So those 3. Does that mean that we're allowed to mistreat somebody who's not technically an orphan, let's say? Are we allowed to do that? These are examples. And these are examples in that society. A foreigner needed to be treated well because a foreigner could not own land. And a foreigner needed employment. So in other words, help them by giving them employment. These are people who were especially vulnerable back then. But in our society, we need to think of not only those people, but anybody who is vulnerable and therefore who needs help. So that still applies, that one, doesn't it? Well, I reckon it does. Next one, please. Stealing sheep or oxen. Now, I don't keep sheep and I don't have a place to put a sheep where we're living in Blattman's Bay. But let's read this. If a man steals, I would say, or a woman, steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, he must pay back 5 head of cattle for the ox and 4 sheep for the sheep. Does that apply? What do you reckon? Has that got anything to do with this at all? You're all stunned. Or you're all so wise that you think the answer's obvious and so you won't say it. Any comments, please?
Could you ask the question again? Because I'm not real good with first of all with questions straight away.
All right, that's all right, Kyle.
Ask me again, please.
Okay. Does this apply to us about the rule about someone who steals a sheep has to pay back 4 sheep?
We shouldn't steal anything.
That's right. Okay. Number 1, it applies to us because it says that stealing anything, whether it's a sheep or whatever else we think we need, it's the principle's all the same, isn't it? Now, what about the business of paying back 4 sheep for the sheep and 5 head of cattle, for the ox?
It's the fine.
Sorry?
Like a fine that we have.
It's like a fine. It can be like a fine. Yeah, and why do we have it? Why is it there?
Deterrent.
As well as a deterrent, yes. And
But it still sort of allows you to steal if you steal and then you can give back as well. Why are you stealing in the first place?
for those people who didn't have a lot of money, you've got to give back 4 sheep instead of 1 sheep. That's a pretty hard thing to do. And remember, sheep is that's your livelihood. You know, that's your income, that's your food. So it's really about restitution. You know, that is not just paying something to the government, but caring for the person who's lost that sheep, that you give back more than what you took. Because that person has lost time trying to find their sheep, and that person has lost, income and food or whatever they're going to do with that sheep, and that person is in turmoil. And so therefore you need to help that person because you've taken from that person. So you recognise the pain you've caused as well as the loss of income and loss of time. So that's about restitution. And I think this is actually a really good principle because today's penalties, if you send someone to jail, for example, that punishes them, but it doesn't help the person who's just lost the sheep or whatever it was that they just lost. So our penalties are not as compassionate as this one, because this one cares for the person who has experienced the loss. So when we have insurance, that's way we get around it. But, when I was in country, Canada, in Mennonite churches, they invented this scheme, and Mennonites invent a lot of good things, for youth that do a lot of crimes. And so it only works with some of them, but it's now being implemented even in Australia. In some places, the police force in some places is implementing it. If you get certain young people, instead of the traditional means of punishment, you get them to come face to face with the person that they've robbed or bashed up or whatever they've done. And then you work out between them how that kid who's done the wrong is going to help the person that they've taken from, to help that person to recover and to help that person to really feel like, there's genuine repentance and there's genuine restitution. And that's actually a principle. They did it in California first. And that really has worked around the world. But that happened while I was in Canada and people I knew. So the story in the New Testament, Zacchaeus, the little man who climbed up a tree to see Jesus, and he was a tax collector. Now the problem was he took more tax than what he was supposed to have taken. And when he met Jesus, he felt guilty. He realised what he'd done. I mean, he knew all along, but now he felt like he had to do something about it. And so seeing Jesus It was like bringing him face to face with God. And what he decided to do off his own bat was to say, I'm going to pay back to everyone I've stolen from. I'm going to pay back 4 times what I've taken. Now, so that would have turned him from being a rich man to a poor man, probably, because he was living off all this extra stuff, taxes that he'd made. That's a big sacrifice. But where did he get that idea from? I reckon it's from this verse. He knew that verse. And so it applied to him then, and I think, we can apply it now. Is that right? Next one, please. This is the third one, the last one we're doing. And you've probably heard of the saying, eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Comes from here, and I'm going to read this verse, a couple of verses down here. If there is a serious injury, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. Now, what was that for? The purpose of this was a good purpose, and it was to adjust the penalty make sure the punishment fits the crime. So that it was to limit the punishment so that, if you had someone come in, if the judge had someone come in and for some reason he didn't like him, but actually he'd only caused, say, a bruise on someone, they just got a bit of light punch or something. He hadn't killed anyone. Then you can't, stone him to death for murder because he hasn't committed murder. You can't, just because you don't like him, you can't do that. If he has only done a small injury, then punishment, he gets a small injury back. I don't know who by the people that he points. If it's a serious injury, like you cause someone to lose an eye, well, do you know what that feels like? You're going to find out, because you're going to lose an eye, right? Whereas a lot of the time we think we can just walk away. But this was to say you need this. You fit the punishment to the crime, and it's not all going to be the same. Now that's actually merciful, unless you've killed someone, in which it's life for life. But it's basically a principle saying that you don't make a really huge penalty for a small crime, and the other way around. And it's not according to the judge, it's according to what has been done. So the same. That's the punishment. It's the same. Now, the eye for an eye and teeth for a tooth comes up in Matthew 5 when Jesus talked about it, and he said, basically, you don't have to actually do that. That's not the only thing you think of. You can give out of grace. You can give forgiveness. You can choose to give when you should be giving punishment, when you should be retaliating. Jesus did not advocate retaliation. So it's not up to me to decide how much retaliation should I get, because basically it's decided throughout the Bible. Vindication is mine, says God. It's up to God to do any acts of vindication. It's not our job to retaliate. That's not what this is about. So Jesus said out of grace, we can give, we can forgive, we can do all that stuff. But if you're talking about legal punishment, like we have laws in our country. And we do have laws. In other words, our laws are based on the eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Our laws are based on giving someone just punishment. That's what that's about. But at a personal level, sometimes it is right to hand someone over to the law. That is right sometimes. But sometimes, at a personal level, I can simply choose to forgive and give grace. I can do that. Does that make sense? Okay, next one. When we come to these laws, we have questions. Have or had, I'm not sure how many questions you have at the moment. How do we read the Old Testament laws now? Are the Old Testament laws for Christians? Can we ignore the Old Testament law? And I know churches that have decided to do that. And one church I know quite well that's decided to do that. Well, I don't think all the people have, but the particular pastor who was preaching on that a few years ago said that. The answer is no, we can't ignore it. We're not supposed to ignore it. Jesus didn't say to ignore Old Testament at all. That was the Bible. And the things that he taught in the New Testament could often only be understood properly in light of what was in the Old Testament. So the two testaments belong together. So how should we apply Old Testament laws today, now? The next one. So we have some guides to interpretation, because some of the Old Testament laws are a bit more difficult for us to figure out how they apply. For example, if they're about sacrificing sheep and lambs and the altar, or bringing your pigeons or your doves or your whatever else. So how do we know what's for us, what's not for us, or what we do about it? So first place we look is Jesus. Jesus guides our interpretation. Number one, some laws he says, again, for example, the Ten Commandments. That tells us we keep the Ten Commandments. They still apply. Even though they were first written in the Old Testament, all of those commandments are repeated through the New Testament several times. So we don't have an option about ditching the Ten Commandments. We can't do that. Some laws, in the second one, Jesus even intensifies, makes stronger. And that's particularly the one about, he says, in the Old Testament it says, do not commit adultery. And he says, but I say to you, whoever looks at a person with lust has committed adultery in their heart. So what he's done is said, let's go to the root of this problem. Adultery is the outward act which is wrong, but the root of it is in the heart of people. And, it's put there as men, but it's not just men, heart of people. And so that law, he didn't say you can throw that out. He said, actually, I'm making it harder. I want you to think of the cause of the adultery, and the cause is in the human heart. Deal with that. The third one, some laws he changes. And this is the example in here is, in the Old Testament it says, if you're going to make an oath, you need to keep it. Okay, that's fair enough. He says, but I say to you, why do you need to make an oath? Why don't you just speak the truth and say what you mean and mean what you say? That's really all you need to do. I don't think I have made a conscious oath in my life. I mean, just thinking about words spoken. Sometimes we do unconscious ones in our mind. But I try to say what I mean and mean what I say. So if I say I'm going to do something, of course I might forget, and of course something else might happen, but my aim is to do that. And if I say this is what I believe, then I try to match that with what's in here. So to be a person where what you see is what you get, as much as possible. Jesus also said something else. He said that he also fulfills the law. Now that relates very much to the sacrifices of animals and the overall way in which all of the Old Testament points to Jesus. And that's the case. Next one. There are some people in Jesus' day who said, but you didn't keep all of the laws. So did Jesus keep all the laws in the Old Testament? Number one, he picked grain on the Sabbath day and he healed people on the Sabbath day. And so some of the Jewish leaders, the Pharisees, said, we've got you, you've broken the law. Is that true? The answer is no, because actually the Old Testament law said you can do those two things on the Sabbath day, and if a donkey falls into a ditch, you can get him out. In other words, be sensible. Yeah, and that says that very clearly in the Old Testament. So that was an accusation, but it was a false accusation. Number two, the Pharisees said, Jesus didn't keep all of the ritual washings and food laws, so therefore he's broken the law. Is that true? No, because they weren't in the Old Testament. They were only made up by these Jewish leaders, around that period. So actually, he did not break any of the Old Testament laws here. Jesus lived as a Jewish boy, a Jewish man, and he did normally keep the Old Testament laws. This is the one and only law that he broke. And this is that he touched a leper. Because in the Old Testament it said, do not touch someone with leprosy. Do you know why? Pardon? You'll catch it. It's contagious. Well, there's a group of sicknesses that come under the banner of leprosy, not only the one we call leprosy today, and a lot of them were contagious. So that was a sensible Old Testament law. We would translate it as, if somebody's got a contagious skin disease, don't touch it. Isn't that sensible? Mm-hmm. That actually applies. Jesus did touch a leper. Why did he do it? Yeah, mercy, grace, healing. And he, being God, had power over the contagious disease. And so, therefore, he was the only one who could touch the leper, and that would have been a comfort to the leper as well. He had the power over it. So that's the only one that he actually broke, and he broke that because he was not going to catch anything contagious. He just healed the man from it. Next one. Nearly there. So I've just put a little summary here. How should we see Old Testament law? First of all, we do not need to keep, Christians do not need to keep laws about sacrifices and Old Testament ways of worship. We find in the New Testament they don't do that. They don't keep all of that. Jesus says fulfill them. So we don't need any sacrifices. Number two, we don't need to keep the civil laws, the rules about government. Why? Because, see, back then in the Old Testament, there was no distinction between the religious laws and the government in the sense because it all went together. But what do we need to do? We need to keep the laws of our own country, or at least the country we're in. So we're in Australia, we need to keep Australian laws. And when we were overseas, even if I'm not an Indian, while I'm in India, I am subject to Indian laws. For example, road rules, if they can even imagine such a thing. We did both get driving licenses in Ethiopia, and that's even worse than India. And yes, we had to learn and obey Ethiopian road rules, and that means you've got the chickens and the donkeys and all of those creatures on the roads, they all get priority. Number 3, we should keep all the laws that are repeated in the New Testament, which includes the 10 Commandments, but also a lot of others. And number 4, we should find the principles in the other laws, even if they don't apply exactly. Like, for example, if you're not going to be stealing sheep, you can surely transfer that to jewellery or to pencil boxes or to whatever else. It doesn't take all that much imagination. We can still find the principles in the other laws because God has given them, and those principles are still good for us. And we can really, lots and lots of those laws, I mean, you can sit there and you can think of all ways in which they apply, in which they're really very helpful for and sensible for living together. Last one. Now, at the end of this section on laws, Moses stood somewhere here and he read out the 3 chapters of laws to the people, and the people said, "We will do everything the Lord has said. We will obey," which is fantastic. And he actually got some sacrifices of animals, and he put some of the blood, sprinkled it on the people, some of it on the altar that he set up. And but then I think I want to read these 2 verses in Exodus 24. Exodus 24 is a wonderful chapter. We're not doing the whole chapter, but this one, we're going to read the verses that I think are the most amazing. And Exodus 24 verses 9 to 11. Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and the 70 elders of Israel, so that's 74 people, went up the mountain and saw the God of Israel. Did you get that? They went up there and they saw God. Under his feet was something like a pavement made of, it's got sapphire in this translation. Do you know the stone lapis lazuli? It's a really brilliant blue. It's a stunning blue, not a light blue, not quite as dark as a royal blue, but a bit sort of in the middle, but a really stunning blue. So it was a very precious stone, still is, well, I think, in some places. Anyway, so under the feet of God, however they saw God, there was this stone, something like a pavement, clear as the sky itself. But God did not raise his hand against these leaders of the Israelites, even though they saw God. They saw God and they ate and drank, which makes me think of communion. In the presence of God, so I'm guessing it was some kind of vision. But can you imagine 74 people having the same vision at the same time? Like, this is something amazing. And in this is as a result of God's command saying specifically who needs to come up the mountain. And bearing in mind, it was after the people said, yes, we will obey these laws. they ate and they drank. It wasn't just 2 seconds. They ate and they drank in the presence of God. I mean, I just think that is so amazing. What an experience. God was pleased with their agreement to the laws. He was pleased that they received them as from himself, from his heart to theirs. And they were together in this meal on top of the mountain. Doesn't give details of what they ate or drink, you don't need to. But that in itself is amazing. That's a symbol of relationship, isn't it? You know, having food together. Here they were having food together with the Lord God. And that's kind of the bookends of these laws. You know, the first was the story about the rescue from slavery. And they're here in the desert. And now they have this experience of being with God in this very strong, visual, probably visionary kind of way. I want to leave it there because the laws are they're not just, you know, something dumped. That's not like a government dumps laws and they don't know the people and the people don't know the government. This is God who knows the people, who just put a lot of effort and energy into rescuing them, who intends to lead them, and who will continue to love them and will continue to walk with them, continue to show them the way, and continue to set them free. Amen.